Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana and his mid-term budget policy statement being billed as the most important indication yet of government's thinking on social spending. The two competing proposals include the Universal Basic Income Grant and the proposed Family Grant, with the latter being rejected by several research organizations as anti-poor and unfeasible. Meanwhile, in the face of the worst economic slump in 100 years and mass unemployment, a pro-stimulus budget is also largely expected. Energy, security and economic growth also high up, of course, on our wish list at South Africa. Let's unpack at least some of these issues. Lebohang Pheko is Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective. Lebohang, it's great to see you this morning. And wow, what a tall order it is for Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to balance all of these various important issues facing our economy. I want to perhaps begin with the issues raised by the Auditor General. 25.9 billion rand in irregular expenditure that has been flagged by the AG's office. I mean, this tells a story about at least part of the job that Enoch Godongwana has to do today.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we keep hearing this. It's either irregular expenditure across several municipalities and government departments or unaccounted for expenditure. And there's a slight distinction between money to go around to extend social and public protection, particularly during this time. So there are three components to what an ideal recovery could potentially look like. The one could be to refract from excessive state-owned, rescuing of state-owned enterprises, which have gone into the billions of rands over the last at least 8 quarters. And even though South African Airways is potentially off the ground right now, we know that it's going to be a long time before it becomes financially viable and sustainable, bearing in mind that it was running for a loss for quite some time. Secondly, bear in mind that also there have been several job losses and company losses. So as of about 3 months ago, we were losing at least 100 small to medium enterprises per week, not even per month, which means potentially about 700 or 800 jobs being lost per month. And remember that these are at least 60 to 70% of job creation, if not more, takes place in that sector. So I think that the minister would do well to favor that particular sector with some kind of extension of relief in some way, because I think the idea that businesses are going to go under without any replication of them and without any feasible way of then reassigning those tasks, those skills, and those capacities into other forms of the song of that, as you rightly say, is family expenditure or social spending. Now, I think the problem that we have as a country is that we have come to view this as some sort of charity, and it is not. It is actually a form of a social contract between the state and its citizens, bearing in mind that the state has its own obligations to make sure that particular functions are fulfilled, including providing social care, health care, education, adequate housing, and social infrastructure. And this feeds into the notion that you can have social infrastructure, whether it is transitional or whether it is that is long term, that recognizes that because of the long unemployment, the huge unemployment figures, that many people are not going to be able to participate in the economy in the same way and in the way that we would hope. So really, I think that the conversation around extending social spending really needs to move around from indeed the poverty shaming charity case model to one that speaks to this as a social compact and a social contract between the state and all of its citizens, particularly those who are the most marginalized and the most economically dispossessed.
Yeah, so on the issue of government social spending, there's obviously a lot of analysis around issues of affordability when it comes to social spending. But what are some of the other arguments that may influence what is announced today, including the issue that you've just raised now, that assumption that spending on welfare comes at the expense of economic growth?
So I think for one thing, it's not per se welfare. Our languaging is quite important. It is a social contract. I think one of the other assumptions is that it makes the assumption that this is a subsidy that a few people are paying on behalf of the many peasants, the many plebeians out there. And I think that's something that we really need to debunk. As a tax base, our formal tax base is quite low in terms of paid employment or formal employment. But we have to, I think that I have for a very long time, I have been saying that our definitions of work and employment require redefinition and rethinking, mainly because very few people, in fact, are employed in the 9-to-5 traditional Fordist way. And the COVID moment has actually brought into these contradictions into place and into much sharper focus. So what we would normally call self-employment or hustling is really the way that most people sustain themselves. So we need, and we're in this self-sustenance, appreciate that every single time that you go and buy a loaf of bread, you put petrol in your car or whatever, everybody participates in the economy and pays a tax on this. So I think that for these lazy other people is completely wrong. There is money, and I think that you mentioned at the very beginning.
I really do apologize to our viewers for the quality of our connection to our guest. Lebohang Pheko is a Trade Collective Senior Research Fellow, and we're unpacking all of the important issues around the budget speech, which is to come at 2 o'clock this afternoon by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana. We're going to try and re-establish our connection with Lebohang Pheko because she's talking about incredibly important issues that no doubt will form part of the Minister's budget today insofar as our social spending is concerned in this year's budget. And thanks so much for staying with us here on the AM Report. Lebohang Pheko is still with us this morning as we talk all things budget speech. Lebohang, do you want to pick up on the issues you were talking about around social spending and the kind of language that we use when we talk about this part of the economy?
Sure. So I was just saying that we need to get away from the notion that it's welfarist, that it's top down, that it's a few people who are subsidizing all these lazy unemployed people who seemingly, don't want to do anything for themselves, which is a complete fallacy. It's very problematic. And bear in mind that the sort of economy that we have is such that we don't really have the Fordist 9-to-5 worker force in practice. Remember that 40% of people on the unofficial scales are unemployed and have been for some time, more since the COVID-19 moment. About 80 to 90% of people across the African continent, not only in South Africa, actually sustain themselves through means that are over and beyond a 9-to-5 job, right? So, the hustle at the traffic lights, hawkers, and so forth. And I think that remember that all of us pay some kind of a tax every time that we go and we make a purchase, whether it's VAT, bread, on our petrol, and so forth. So this notion that there are a few people who are over-subsidizing, and frankly, a few white people who are subsidizing for these lazy black people is very problematic. And I think that poverty shaming translates into our policy framing, and the budget needs to be very mindful of that. I've heard people talking about the Bolsa Familia, which is a Brazilian model of wealth transfer, I would call it, cash transfer within families, which under the President Lula da Silva regime did see many more people, a third of poverty decreased, where Brazil and South Africa used to be on par in terms of our inequality indices. The Brazil, in just a generation, managed to go much further. That model in and of itself, by the way, is not without its many, many flaws. But I certainly do think that it flies in the face that a country of medium income, which has a huge glut of unemployed and intergenerationally impoverished and dispossessed people, cannot in some way significantly and intentionally try to pull people out of that situation is really not true.
So, Lebohang, when we talk about grants, and there are a number of them that are on the table, right? There's discussion around the continuation of the social relief of distress grant under COVID-19, that should continue. There's the universal basic income grant. There's also the family grant, which has come under some criticism. But when we talk about the efficiency of a grant, what do we mean by that?
I think really people want to assume that things like impoverishment and unemployment can be scientifically managed, and unfortunately they cannot, especially because we don't have policy coherence. So I think the efficiency model is also it's quite neoliberal, quite frankly. It's kind of a market orthodox model that suggests that you need a return on your investment.
Right.
Now, if we assume that people are an investment that is a long-term, longitudinal, intergenerational investment, we will probably rethink and reframe the ways in which we want to, rethink social expenditure. And I think, there are a few components, as you say, the universal basic grant and this relief, this sustenance grant of 250 rands, which really, in the scheme of humanity, is not that much. But also the health spending on COVID-19, which was part of a huge part of the glut of this expenditure. And actually, this was just basically a cash facility made available to enable different departments to make sure that they could provide water, they could provide sanitation. And what this actually exposes is that many of these grants and much of this relief is as a result of the poor social and physical infrastructure. That has been the case, and that has been the reality for many years prior to COVID-19. So, I think in business language, which isn't per se the language that I would use, why put a good crisis to waste, and why not let this teach us the lessons, especially the policymakers, the lessons that you cannot neglect one form of social expenditure over another. It also illustrates that this trickle-down theory that eventually, if you have, foreign direct investment, things are going to suddenly trickle down. A state needs to be a state, and it needs to put in place the adequate infrastructure for its citizens and all who reside in its borders to be able to function appropriately, which is why social infrastructure, social spending, and the grant discourse are tightly intertwined.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, depending on what the finance minister says today, whether everything you've mentioned does form part of government's thinking when it comes to social spending. Lebohang Pheko, let me thank you for your time and for your patience this morning. She's the Trade Collective's Senior Research Fellow as we talk all things Budget Day.